If you haven't seen my last two videos where I covered the vampire team and the independent roles, make sure to check that out and hit that subscribe button. Hello everyone, Hobbyist here, back at it again with the next video. And now, we are going to be covering the village team inside of One Night Ultimate Vampire. So, this one's going to be a little bit different because of the fact that there's a lot more roles to cover and there's a lot more variables to cover. Considering that all four villagers in the back all have marks that they add towards One Night Ultimate Vampire, as the mark system is the main mechanic that makes it different from any other game in the One Night series, we're gonna just go through an overview and just remind you of what each of the characters do. Just so that way we're in the right headspace, that way we know what our next step is. So, starting from the left, we have the Diseased. When the Diseased wakes up during the dusk phase, they will have the ability to place the mark of the Diseased either on their neighbor to their left or the neighbor to their right. And that's all that they'll do. They'll just simply go back to sleep from that point. The Instigator will then wake up at some point during the dusk phase and will give somebody the mark of the traitor. The Priest will wake up during the dusk phase and will be able to give himself a mark of clarity and has the option to give anybody his second mark of clarity, but he doesn't have to. Cupid will assign to two other players a mark of love. As a reminder of what each of these marks do, the mark of the disease makes it so that whoever the player that has it, if they receive the most votes, everyone who voted for that player loses regardless on if their team wins. The mark of the traitor simply means that you have to ensure that whoever is on your current team has to die in order for you to win. So for example, if you're on the village team and you have the mark of the traitor, then you have to make sure that somebody on the village team dies in order for you to win, as it changes your objective. If you're on the vampire team, then you would betray the vampire team by having one of your teammates die. If you're neutral, however, this mark does nothing for you. Marks of clarity are just the de factos, and the marks of love link you together. So if one person with a mark of love dies, the other person who also has a mark of love also dies, regardless of what team you're on. Towards the bottom, we have the Pickpocket, who has the ability to exchange his mark with any other player's mark and look at the new mark that he gets. During the night phase, the Gremlin has the ability to switch any two players' cards or marks, but he can't do both. Then we have the Marksman, who has the ability to either look at one person's card and then also has the ability to look at a different player's mark. It's not an either option. I don't know what that came in my brain, but it's one mark of one player and a card from a different player. So you get different sources of information.
First character that we're going to talk about on the village team is that we're going to be talking about the Diseased. We talked about her ability earlier, but we kind of need to go into a bit more detail as far as if you are the Diseased, how you're going to help the village team. Because of the way that the Diseased is formatted, it's going to be quite difficult to be able to know what it is exactly that you're going to be able to do. Because the Diseased herself already is a poison that people don't want to vote for. Because anyone who votes for the Diseased herself outside of the mark also loses the game. So if you manage to catch it correctly, you could catch vampires trying to vote for you, and you can be that sort of bait. But the problem is that the mark that she gives is both a blessing and a curse at the same time. Because if you manage to get it to a villager, then you're essentially protecting a vampire from voting for that person, or any other villagers from voting for that person. Because, well, then nobody wants to vote for them. But at the same time, if you manage to put a mark of the Diseased on the vampires, well then, at that point, you even make it even harder, to where even if the villagers decide that they have figured out who their vampire is, if they have the mark of the disease, you've essentially just screwed them out of an opportunity. So you're very you have sort of the opposite effect that the master has. To where instead of trying to be the target of votes for the sake of deflecting into different vote patterns, you affect the votes because you cause everyone who votes for you or anyone with your mark to lose. So you have to be really careful. Oftentimes, if you're a diseased players are going to want to play with open information. You're going to want to specifically say, hey, I'm diseased, don't vote for me. I put my mark of the disease on this player. Do not vote for this player. But the only other problem with that is that because the diseased controls that much of the voting power, that also means that the vampires are going to want to take advantage of that. As I mentioned in my vampires video when I covered the vampire team, the diseased is going to be a good role for the vampires to want to bluff as, because they have one mark just like she does, and she's going to discourage players from wanting to vote for that particular player. So as far as information gathering, she's absolutely terrible, but that's not her role. When it comes to how much impact she has on the game, she has quite a bit of impact because she breaks up the teams based on the voting patterns of everybody around them. So instead of just simply working around the lies and getting the vampires, now it's an additional layer of, if she's on the village team, it's how do we make sure that we don't vote for the diseased player so that way I myself don't lose? How do we also make sure that we don't waste our vote on the Renfield because he's just a minion? How do we make sure that we don't vote for the master so that way all of our majority votes get redirected onto the next highest vote? So voting is a lot more crucial inside of One Night Ultimate Vampire with the diseased in play. So I genuinely do believe that her character, her role, has pretty high impact on the game overall. So with that said, this is my final score for the diseased, both as a villager and what you are trying to accomplish, and as a vampire on the opposite side. So now the next role that we're going to talk about is Cupid. Cupid's a very interesting role for the village team because her marks of love essentially link players together. And as far as a village is concerned, that's not too much of a problem. If you manage to accidentally put both your marks of love on villagers, that's just unfortunate. So you might not be able to get the vampires this time. But the biggest thing that makes her a threat to the vampire team is that if she manages to get at least one vampire linked to another person, then there starts to become some problems. Because the thing that you'll definitely notice behavior-wise, if you're reading the room and watching how everybody's interacting, is that if a vampire is linked to somebody else, especially if they're either a villager or not, it doesn't truly matter what role they are, 90% of the time, if they're being overly protective or being like, please don't vote for this person, please don't vote for me, or please don't vote for this person, it's because they're a vampire. Vampires, remember, the vampire team's objective is to make sure nobody on their team dies. So if if somebody is being overly concerned and one vampire dies at the bare minimum, even if like 3 villagers die, as crazy as that sounds, as long as you get one vampire, the whole village team still wins. Another interesting thing about Cupid, as far as what you're strategizing for as the village team, is that Cupid has a way to bypass the master's ability. If you think about it, if you manage to avoid the master and you are able to vote for, say, the count or the vampire, but the master is linked, via Cupid's marks of love, then the master can die. In addition to that, killing 2 vampires in 1 stone. So that's a very easy way to get around that. As far as information goes, she has absolutely nothing. She's in that same boat as the diseased in that regard. Impact on the game, I'd say she's a couple steps down from the diseased because, sure, as a vampire or any minority team, especially inside of epic battles where you have werewolves and aliens too, she's going to be a problem because if you link the right people, then certain people have to be protected when they otherwise wouldn't be protected, especially by the minority teams. But if it's by 2 villagers, that's not really a concern for the village team. So that's just something to keep in mind. As far as bluffing as Cupid goes, as a vampire, you're going to want to communicate that in some way to the rest of your team that you're trying to bluff as Cupid. Because even if you say you put marks on 2 different people, if the rest of the village team isn't stunned by this, then it's not really effective. There's no effective threat for the village team to be bluffed against as Cupid and saying, I put my mark of love on this guy and this guy. It's just a matter of, at that point, trying to convince that one of the people that are linked in the mark of love are a vampire, which may put people on the back pedal, which might turn to being convincing that it's a vampire who's trying to set up a lie at some point. So yeah, Cupid is really difficult to bluff as effectively because her marks of love don't affect the village team as heavily in comparison to pretty much any other role that I've mentioned that the vampires can bluff as. So let's go ahead and look down a little bit and see what people say as far as any additional things that you might want to think about as Cupid. Other things that the people of the One Night community have said, especially here, is that Cupid shouldn't give herself a mark of love, as it's really only helpful if a villager and a vampire receive it, and giving it to 2 random players makes it more likely that a vampire is going to get it. That honestly just makes the most sense in the world. If you don't see another person wake up when lovers are asked to wake up, remember, inside the dusk phase, the lovers are going to be the last set of people to wake up at the same time before the night phase begins. But if that happens, you know that either your lover has been given a mark of clarity, is a traitor, or an assassin. If this happens, then you know that one of these roles is in the game. It also means that if only one of those roles, the priest, the instigator, and the assassin, are being played with, you know that it is in play. This is usually only that helpful with an assassin. So, essentially meaning that taking it into consideration is this. It's because it's a little bit of a deep strategy to kind of think about. And I'll leave visuals up here for you to see. You have a lover, and normally you're supposed to wake up with them at the same time. The other possible scenario could be that they were a vampire, but let's be realistic here. When it comes to the turn order and you get that memorized, especially going back to my video where I talked about the night order, the vampires are way earlier in the dusk phase. The assassin and or the apprentice assassin are the last 2 roles to potentially place marks before the dusk phase ends. And the instigator is pretty close to the bottom when it comes to being last. The only other role that goes before any of the assassin roles is the priest. So, again, when it comes to being able to master this game and being able to understand what roles go when and the possibility of certain situations happening, you know that only a priest or an assassin can really do anything to throw off the lovers. Anything. Because the vampires would have gone first, then the disease would have happened, then Cupid would have happened. And then if anything happens to Cupid, it's because of either the priest, the instigator, or the assassin. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. And honestly, just from a setup standpoint, Cupid is way better in larger groups than it is in smaller groups. Because linking two people significantly cripples what the vampires are trying to do. So now we have the Instigator. Now the Instigator is very interesting because even though she works for the village team, she has the ability to make somebody betray the village team if she isn't careful. She also has the ability to potentially make a vampire betray their own team. And even though this is sort of an unsportsmanlike thing to do, it's very possible that if you get it on a vampire, it's possible that that vampire with that traitor mark will simply just out the rest of the vampires immediately. To where the master can be like, yep, I've got the traitor mark. This is the count. This is the vampire. That's Renfield. And generally, that's pretty deflating as a player. But then again, that could be said of any claim whatsoever. You could fake snitch if possible. So there's that little element to it. The Instigator, again, is another role like the Diseased and Cupid that doesn't really affect the actual information that the village team brings to the table. Rather, the Instigator is a role that cripples the vampire team. And I think that's just kind of the sort of balance that we see with the village team in comparison and how they're trying to fight back. Because the vampire team can already amass an army of at least 4 vampires. Because it's the Master, the Vampire, the Count, Renfield, and the Mark of the Vampire, whoever that went to, that are all vampires. Well, technically not Renfield, but you get my idea. So, being able to cause a rift with the Instigator between the vampires is huge. As far as bluffing as the Instigator goes, you could make it work. You could insinuate or immediately fake that this person was on your team and that they're a vampire or whatever they could be. The neutral roles have an advantage when it comes to this because they could immediately be working on either side and portray either side, but still use it to their advantage to complete their objective. For example, like the assassin could put a mark on somebody else, get the mark of the traitor for themselves, and then immediately out that person if they were able to gain their trust on what their role is by claiming that they were a vampire. If you can get that from the neutral players, then that benefits the vampire team pretty well, in addition to the assassin or the apprentice assassin. So the Instigator has to be a little bit careful when it comes to that regard. So here's a couple of other points that have been listed here on the wiki and by the community. So if you give the mark to the traitor to yourself, you essentially join the vampire team. Or it could be you've joined the neutral team, because you essentially are helping get a villager lynched instead of a vampire. Some other things to consider is that if you gave it to someone on Team Village, they are now working against your interests. So you should say at that point in time who you gave the mark of the traitor to remove their credibility. So if someone's trying to insinuate to you that you are a vampire and that they're really going hard on you, like, no, you're a vampire because of this, 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 and this, then you could remove their credibility by saying, you're only trying to insinuate that I am a vampire because you have the mark of the traitor. Which looks really, really, really bad. That's a great argument to use both as a vampire, and it's great to use as a villager. So it could work either way. Honestly, because of the way that the Mark of the Traitor works, you don't have a reason to lie about it as far as who you gave it to, as everyone sees their mark at the end of the dusk phase, and any mark that has been moved will likely be known early in the discussion. So, even though there are some marks, like Mark of the Vampire especially, that you definitely want to hide, there are plenty of other marks that you want to publicly put out there. If you decided to give yourself the traitor, you might want to out yourself if the vampires might gain the majority. So, if the vampires are concerned whether to trust you or not, you could just simply say, I've got the mark of the traitor. Let's go ahead and get these guys. Then, secretly, that could mean that the vampires might start to help you now, because you want a villager dead in order for you to win. You could easily counterclaim someone and get them lynched. The only way that the instigator can really be outed as far as what happens is that if the marksman looks at your mark, so that you really have power to really push the blame on somebody else. Pretty much with anything that they say. If they're saying that you're lying because of this reason, you can just simply cut it off right there at the hip by saying, you're only saying that because you have the mark of the traitor. Because I gave you the mark of the traitor. So, it's a bit of an aggressive play with the instigator. But if that's your personality type and that's the way that you are inside of this game, you're not the guy who likes to sit back and watch and kind of form strings and meticulously put stuff together. If you want to be more aggressive, the instigator and bluffing as the instigator are the perfect ways to go about it.